So good evening. Um, Apologies for a rather long delay. And thank you for your supreme patience. It's really wonderful to be practicing with Zen practitioners. They say that Zazen is good for nothing, but tonight is evidence that it is good for something. It is good for giving space and waiting patiently with a big mind. Many years ago, when my spiritual path was starting, I was going to Bernie and Mark's Wiccan Coven and had also started meditating with what was then the Western Buddhist order. And in the Wiccan Coven, everything was kind of experimented with or practiced, whichever way you want to understand it. There was the Kabbalah, there was the Tarot, and there was also the I Ching. And I remember on one occasion, I took the I Ching home with me and was reading into it, and I thought, there's not really a whole lot in this. But there was one phrase that stuck with me, and I figured it was worth remembering. So that's what I did. I remembered it. I don't know which lines of the hexagram arrangements it is, but it said, times of growth are beset with difficulties. They resemble a first birth. Yet these difficulties arise from the very profusion of all that is struggling to attain form. And I thought that was really good. And because I memorized it, it's been a handy kind of touchstone over the years. When you start something and there's difficulty in the beginning, it's a good one to call up and say to myself, times of growth are beset with difficulties. They resemble a first birth. Yet these very difficulties arise from the very profusion of all that is struggling to attain form. So all that is struggling to become, that's where our difficulties come from. And I've been thinking of that today before I even had these sound issues. I was thinking of this phrase because our second practice period is underway, and in it there are difficulties. Yet these very difficulties arise from what is struggling to attain form or what is struggling to become. I don't want to emphasize the word struggling because we're all practitioners. So what may look like a struggle isn't really a struggle. We take it in our stride. But one or two people have said to me that they feel challenged by the practice period. And one or two other people have said to me they feel apprehensive about the practice period. So I kind of feel as though that's the way it is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a little bit daunting. A little bit, am I sure I want to step into this? A little bit like I'm stepping into something. And it is a little bit daunting to think that you are delineating your routine for the next 2 months. That you are making a commitment of what you will be doing for the next 2 months. That can be a little bit threatening. And perhaps it's just the same as if you were starting a course in, I don't know, baking, and it required a commitment for 2 nights a week. Maybe there would be a little bit of apprehension before you start that, wondering, am I ready for this? Or will I be able to do it? But it's also a challenge in another way. This practice period is an experiment. And so, although the routine, or there is a schedule set out, it's not clear that it's not clear how workable that schedule is. For individuals and for us as a collective. And so the experiment is to find out, does this actually work? This is our second practice period, our second online practice period. And the first one, we kind of fell into it, stumbled into it. There was the arrival of COVID, and then there was a lockdown, and there was a feeling that a response of some sort was needed. So I agreed or suggested, I'm not too sure which came first, that I would give a Dharma talk, and that led to another one. And I think it was in the second one, the idea that lockdown could actually be used or interpreted as a practice period. A kind of practice period that was enforced upon us, or an opportunity that was thrown at us. And we took it, and we made it into a practice period. And now it kind of feels as though, having started this practice period more intentionally, the Irish government at least has decided to support it by calling another lockdown. Okay. So by doing this, by quietening down the whole country, it's like they are supporting our practice period. I know they're not, they don't see it that way, but we can interpret it that way. And it's possible that the UK government will follow suit in part or in whole soon. So we'll be in the middle of another COVID lockdown practice period. But even if we don't get that support, we can forge ahead with our winter online practice period. This practice period had more intentionality behind it. It wasn't like finding ourselves in the middle of lockdown or at the beginning of lockdown and saying, hey, this could be used as a practice period. No, it was more, having done that practice period, was more like, wouldn't it be good if we had another practice period? And so we formed this one. And there was more advanced thinking, forethought put into it. And that can lead to, ambition. I have great ambitions for our chanting practice. And I also have some doubts as to whether it's good or not. There are aspects to it that I really enjoy. And I'm also aware that, it poses challenges and difficulties for people. And I think it's not just for me, but for us to decide whether it's working or not, whether it is a positive addition to the practice period or whether it is detracting from it. We're in a situation where we are heavily reliant on technology, as demonstrated by tonight's beginning. And to me, what I would hope is that we simplify things as much as possible. So this morning I thought we could simply not chant, do 2 periods of zazen and bow to each other. And then I thought, well, we'd be missing out on some things then. But I'm also aware of the difficulties of the chanting. There's fun and there's difficulties. And I thought, well, if people don't like it, we will soon find out because they'll be leaving before it happens. They'll be bowing out at the end of zazen. I can't make it. So I would like to invite your feedback as to whether or not you think the chanting is a net positive or a net negative. Does it enhance the practice period or does it subtract from it? We make things up as we go along. I know if you've just joined the practice period, it might feel as though a lot of things were made up before you joined. And that's probably true because we put some thought into it beforehand. But we are making it up. It's not yet written in stone or wood or whatever it is that they use to cement things in. Stone, I suppose. It's still, although the schedule is set, there is still room for flexibility, fluidity, and change. So what makes it a practice period? There is the intention to follow a schedule, the intention to adopt a certain routine, the intention to put practice into a more central position of our life. I think that's what makes it a practice period, the intention to do that and the translating of that intention into actuality somehow. So I'm a big fan of movies and films. And I think that they can be a great way to get lost in other people's karma and to kind of see, would you make the same mistakes, or would you take the same risks? Could you see yourself in their position? And usually I can't. There's no way. There's no way I would take that kind of risk. There's no way I would do that kind of thing. And I wouldn't react to the situation the way they have done. But gosh, I can appreciate how, if the story is written well and their actions seem to be consistent with their character, you can see how somebody would get themselves into that kind of a mess, or how they would get themselves into that kind of outcome. And that can be a good opportunity to reflect on, well, what do I do that gets me into a mess? I design practice periods. Another, excuse me. Another fine mess I've gotten myself into. But behind that, there is all this sense that it is for the good. It is part of this movement towards something more satisfying, more liberating, this movement towards freedom. And so, yes, today I was noticing some mistakes and thinking, did I really have to make it this complicated? And I said, well, that's part of my karma. And it isn't bad. It isn't bad if I maintain an attitude of flexibility. What would be bad would be if I became inflexible about it. But it did strike me as funny that I should, what I'm comparing it to is what life would have been like if I hadn't have had this great idea. You know, where you get up in the morning, have breakfast or meditate, take a shower, go out and enjoy the countryside, and maybe talk to a few people, get a few jobs done, maybe do a few jobs for somebody else, which brings in some money, and just be grounded in the physical, practical world. A simple life. A simple life of chainsaws, broken sockets, carrots, potatoes, that kind of thing. Not to have to fiddle with Messenger, Facebook, Audacity, system settings. Right? How simple life would have been if I didn't have this great idea. And at the same time, I deeply appreciate sitting and chanting with all of you. And during the morning and evening chants, I don't know who's going to chant what, because the Kokyo is assigning colors and roles and other complicated stuff. But as I stand there in the doshi position and I hear the voices coming through, it's great because I recognize most of them. And that's touching. That's connecting with you on some level. And that's kind of what our practice is about. It's a way of spending time together. And then we get into one of my other things. I don't like to use the word spending time. I often hear it. I prefer to use sharing time. It's a way of sharing time with each other. There are many ways to share time with each other. And practice is a deeply enriching and connecting way to do it. And I think that's why we practice together. Because given that we have to be together in some way or another, practice is probably one of the best ways to do it. It's in the practice that we appreciate each other and walk this earth together. It's in this practice that we come to love the life that we live and the people that we live it with. So the technology can be clunky and it can seem intrusive or invasive or obstacled. But we can become familiar enough with it that it becomes more fluid and gets less in the way. I remember when I worked in Tassajara Reservations office in San Francisco, Zen Center, the first year was 98. And their system that they'd been using up until then was really getting to the edge of its ability to cope. And every so often, there were 4 of us with 4 computers, and we were in 2 different rooms with a connecting door. Every so often, the system would crash, so we'd have to take phone calls and tell people that we will call them back when the system is up and running. And there was a guy in the accounting office who was kind of a old-time computer geek. So he was much older than us, but he was the only one who knew about the computers. And he seemed to know where to kick it or what to do with it to get the system back. And then it would be madness trying to catch up. Right? Now, to make things worse, we had clipboards because the system wasn't perfectly designed for the need of making bookings into Tassajara. So we had rules like at Tassajara, this is during the summertime when it's a guest resort rather than a place for monastic practice, or rather than formal monastic training. It's a guest resort. But we still had rules like not more than 5 children would be there at any given time. And the computer wouldn't alert us if this happened. So we had a clipboard keeping track of the number of children booked in each day. The dining room capacity is something like, I think it's 80 people. And the system could tell us that, but only if we didn't book in extra guests. You see, an extra guest would happen if you've got a room for 2 people, but they want to bring a 3rd person in on a futon on the floor. So the computer system wouldn't count that as an extra guest. So it could give us a count of 75 people, but there could be 6 or 7 extra guests. So we had to keep another clipboard with the extra guests on it. Then the system could not keep track of carpooling. If somebody wanted a lift from San Francisco to Tassajara, or somebody wanted a lift from somewhere else to Tassajara, or somebody was offering a lift, couldn't keep track of all that. So we had another clipboard. And you've got to imagine the situation. These clipboards, I think there were 4 of them, although I only remembered 3 of them. Children, extra guests for the dining room, and carpooling. I think there may have been a 4th one. But these clipboards were shared between 2 rooms. So you could be taking a reservation on the telephone and the person wants to book in an extra guest. So you have to find the clipboard that tells you how many extra guests you have on the nights of their arrival and departure, in between, the nights of their stay. And it may be that that clipboard is in the next room. Okay, but the person in the next room may actually need the clipboard that's in your room. So you're crashing into each other with looking for this clipboard, looking for that clipboard. The system, you're trying to make reservations, the phones are ringing, the system crashes. You've got to somehow remember where you were, because the system is not going to remember what your booking was if it crashes. And I remember thinking early on in this madness, this is unethical. I got it into my head. This was unethical to ask people to work under these conditions. Okay. I mean, no, it wasn't. I knew it wasn't, but it felt like it was pushing our buttons to the limit, and maybe in some cases beyond the limit. That for a company called San Francisco Zen Center, which was presumably promoting peace and harmony in the world, to create a work environment which was so stressful seemed wrong. On the other hand, there was a whole kitchen crew that would do our cooking. We had 2 periods of zazen in the morning and then a wonderful Buddha hall to go to for morning service. Wonderful food prepared for us all the time. So there was a great support, and then there was this crazy work environment. And I just started to ask myself, how do I make this a practice? How do I make this into a practice? And I found that as I asked that question, things began to flow more smoothly and more easily. Now, part of it is that we were becoming more familiar with the systems, and we were able to transition from one room to the other room in search of the required clipboard more smoothly and without crashing into each other and without that sense of urgency. But I really did feel that asking the question, how do I make this into a practice, helped. It helped to make it or transform it into a practice. So I don't know how this practice period is going for you, and we are in the early days. I think this is our 3rd full day. Now, there was nothing on the schedule for Monday, but it still counts as a day of the practice period. Same with any other day that doesn't have something on the schedule. You're still in the practice period, and you may have your own things that you've added into your practice period. So if you are finding it a challenge, you may find it helpful to ask, well, how do I make this into a practice period? Or how do I make this particular aspect of it into a practice? I was talking to the Doan group earlier today, And I said, you know, by the time we get to the end of the practice period, we'll probably have this down to a fine art. And we can look back over the 8 weeks and think of how clumsy we were at the beginning compared to how smooth and slick we are at the end. Or it might not go that way. I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. We'll stay with it for a while, and if people decide that they don't like it, I know that they'll start not showing up, and that will be perhaps a message that we need to take a different path. And the way I'm describing it may sound as though I'm getting some negative feedback about it. I'm not really. If anything, I'm getting positive feedback about it. But I know that people are finding it a little bit stressful at the same time. And there is plenty of creases to be ironed out. And we may come up with ways of ironing them out, or we may come up with ways of living more comfortably with them. Every so often, I have what I just call a liberating thought. And I think this resulted or followed one of the conversations that I had during the week. And after the conversation, I thought, you know, you can't waste time. And then I started off on a whole train of thought. You can't waste time. If you go to Tassajara, Green Gulch, or San Francisco, and I suppose any other Zen temple, and it will soon be at Ingen-ji too when I get my han. The han is a block of wood that is struck with a wooden mallet, and on it is inscribed, "Great is the matter of birth and death. Do not waste time." And in one sense, that's what we're doing with the practice period. We're setting aside time to pay more attention to the things that are important to us. We're putting a greater emphasis on the things that we consider to be important. But one of the things that can go with that thinking is, I shouldn't waste time. And my response is, you can't waste time. This is one of the delightful contradictions or paradoxes of Zen. On the one hand, you can't waste time. And on the other hand, you shouldn't waste time. And the best way around it is to think in terms of the relative and the absolute. From the perspective of the absolute, you can't waste time. I mean, where would all that wasted time go? And I would even go so far as to say that if you think that you can waste time, you've already got the wrong end of the stick, or you have a mistaken grasp of what time is. you also cannot waste energy. So isn't this a liberating thought, to think that I cannot waste any time and I cannot waste any energy? That's from the absolute point of view. It's like all the energy that's in the universe is the same as it was at the beginning. There's no more, no less. And the same would go perhaps for the time. The same amount of time is in the universe as there was at the beginning. Time is not something that you can waste because you don't own it. And it, in a sense, it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with the you that owns things. That's your grandiose idea about owning time. So that's the liberating thought. You cannot waste time. And then you may say, well, you mean it doesn't matter what I do? Well, actually, it does matter what you do. But if you don't do what you need to do, you're still not wasting time. You're experiencing something else. You're experiencing a loss and possibly grieving for not doing what you most want to do. And it can be tempting to dismiss that grief or that loss by telling yourself, I'm wasting time. About 20 years ago, I was visiting Ireland from California, and I was interested in finding out if there were other Zen groups around Dublin. And I found that there was this Zen retreat on in the Wicklow Hills, or mountains as they're sometimes called. And it was being led by Sister Gina from the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. So I went along with it, or to it. I did the retreat, weekend retreat. And a little bit like the Western Buddhist order, everybody was a little bit too lovey-dovey and positive, but that aside, they were a good bunch of people. I do remember Sister Gina telling the story. And as far as I know, she was Dutch-Irish. So she grew up in Ireland, further south of Wicklow. She grew up in Wexford. And she would go to visit her aging, not Asian, but aging uncle. And she would be in a little bit of a hurry, and he would say, will you stay for a cup of tea? And she would say, no, I have to go to my meditation group, or I have to do this, or I have to do that. And he would say to her, sit down there now and have a cup of tea. When God made time, he made plenty of it. As if that would solve the dilemma. And on one hand, it does. We're really deluding ourselves when we think that we are wasting time. And at the same time, There's something in us that says, do what is most important. Give yourself to that which is most important. There's something in us that does not want to waste this opportunity of our lifetime. And that is it. That is the front and back foot in walking. We need both feet to go forward. I mean, we can do it on one foot, which is what we do most of the time. We hop along. But if we actually have the other foot, the one that says, the back foot, the one that says, you cannot waste time, in that thought, you find your freedom. And it allows you to move forward more effectively. So I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you all very much.